This episode contains discussions of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. Between 1975 and 1980, 13 women were killed across the north of England, and many more were attacked and survived. Over several years, the man responsible moved through cities, towns, and residential streets without being stopped, despite repeated investigations, multiple lines of inquiry, and what would later be recognised as one of the largest manhunts in British criminal history. It is easy looking back now to view this as a single continuous story, something that builds steadily towards recognition and resolution. But at the time, that isn't how it felt. There was no clear beginning, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, what existed were individual events, each serious, each investigated, each significant in its own right, but not yet understood as part of something larger. And that distinction matters because it changes how we understand everything that followed. This case did not begin with certainty. It began with uncertainty. And that uncertainty shaped how events were interpreted, how decisions were made, and ultimately how long it took for the full pattern to be recognised. Welcome. As always, it's a pleasure to have you with me. I'm Jenny. I love history and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles, Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper. Episode 1, The Conditions. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge something. Podcasts like Seriously by Annie Elise were a big part of what gave me the confidence to start this. So if you are listening, thank you. To understand what happened during these years, it is important to take a step back. Because beginning with the individual responsible would mean starting too late. By the time his name became widely known, the conditions that had allowed him to operate had already been in place for some time. And those conditions, those are where this story really begins. What we're looking at here is not a clear sequence of events, unfolding in a way that was immediately recognisable. Instead, it is a series of moments, fragments of information that at the time did not yet form a pattern. Each incident was understood in isolation, shaped by what could be seen and known in that moment, rather than what might have been developing over a longer period of time. To make sense of that, it helps to step into northern England in the mid-1970s. Not just as a place on a map, but as an environment people lived in day to day. Cities such as Leeds, Bradford, and Manchester were shaped by industry. And that meant work was often physical, structured, and demanding. Factories, mills, and warehouses didn't just define employment. They shaped routines, expectations, and the rhythm of everyday life. For many people, that rhythm didn't follow a standard daytime pattern. Instead, it moved in shifts. Early mornings, late evenings, and overnight work. That meant the city itself was constantly in motion. At almost any hour, there were people moving through it. Workers finishing shifts, others beginning them. People travelling home or heading out as part of routines that had become entirely normal. In the evenings, the atmosphere changed. Pubs filled, conversations spilled out into the streets, and there was a sense of activity that felt familiar and shared. But as the night went on, that environment shifted again. Shops closed. Public transport became less frequent. And the steady movement of people began to thin. What remained wasn't silence, but something quieter. Longer stretches between encounters, fewer people around, and a different kind of awareness that came with it. For someone walking home at night, that shift in atmosphere could be felt in subtle ways. The street might not be empty, but it was no longer busy. And that changes how space feels. You might notice the sound of your own footsteps more clearly, or become aware of someone else moving through the same space, even if nothing has actually happened. It is often in those moments that small decisions begin to take shape. You might adjust your pace slightly, cross the road, or choose a different route. Not because of anything specific, but because something feels uncertain. These aren't dramatic reactions, they are quiet, instinctive adjustments that reflect an underlying awareness of the environment. For many women, this kind of thinking was part of everyday life. Not constant fear, but a steady awareness that influenced how decisions were made. Routes were chosen not just for convenience, but for visibility. Main roads might be preferred over quieter streets, even if they took a little bit longer. And certain areas might be avoided at certain times, based on experience and shared understanding. That awareness didn't come from formal guidance. It developed gradually, shaped by experience and conversation. People shared what they knew, often in simple terms. Suggestions about which route felt safer, or which areas were better avoided. And over time, those small pieces of information became part of how individuals navigated their surroundings. It is important to remember that this wasn't about fear in a constant or overwhelming sense. It was about adaptation. People responding to their environment in ways that felt practical and reasonable, even if the full picture wasn't yet clear. Within this environment, the early incidents of violence began to occur. Women were attacked in different locations, at different times, and under different circumstances. Some survived. Others were seriously injured. And each case mattered in its own right, something it is important not to lose sight of. At the time, these incidents were taken seriously and investigated accordingly. However, they were largely treated as separate events. There was no clear framework linking them together, no immediate understanding that they might form part of a developing pattern. Instead, they were interpreted individually, based on what could be seen and known in that moment. This is where things become more complex. Because patterns don't simply exist in events, they exist in how those events are recognized. And recognition depends heavily on expectation. At this stage, investigators were working with information that appeared disconnected. Different locations would have suggested different offenders, and the different circumstances suggested different motivations. Without an expectation that these incidents might be linked, the possibility of connection became harder to identify. If we look back now, it may seem obvious that a pattern was forming. But at the time, that clarity did not exist. People were working with the information available to them, interpreting it in ways that felt logical and consistent with what they understood. Outside of the investigation, awareness was also beginning to change, although not in a clear or structured way. Information circulated through conversation rather than official communication, and people began to share what they had heard, even when that information was incomplete. As a result, behaviour started to shift. Women adjusted their routines, reconsidered their routes, and made small changes to how they moved through the city. These may not have been dramatic changes, but they reflected a growing sense that there was something that wasn't quite right. Fear, in this context, did not arrive suddenly. It developed gradually, shaped by small pieces of information, partial understanding, and moments that did not fully make sense. Over time, those elements combined to create awareness, not clarity, but a sense that something was present, even if it could not yet be fully explained. At the centre of this case was Peter Sutcliffe. But focusing only on him risks missing something very important. What allowed him to operate wasn't just what he did, but how those actions were interpreted within the environment around him. One of the most significant factors in this case was the development of assumptions, particularly around who was at risk and the nature of the violence taking place. Some victims were described in ways that categorized them, and that categorization influenced how events were understood. When violence is perceived as affecting a specific group, it can create a sense of limitation. A belief, if you will, that the risk is contained within certain boundaries. But violence doesn't follow those boundaries. And when understanding is shaped by assumption, patterns can exist without being fully recognized. At this stage, something critical was beginning to take shape. A gap between what was happening and what was understood. The behaviour was escalating. The conditions were aligning. And the pattern was beginning to form, but it had not yet been fully recognised. In the next episode, we begin to explore the point at which belief starts to influence behaviour, and how the internal framework behind this violence begins to move into action. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow so that you don't miss what comes next. As always, until next time, be gentle with what history leaves behind.